This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzanotes, and today is Saturday, and that means it's time for another edition of Nizzanotes, my weekly vlog series about limited magic. We're in the early stages of a brand new format, that format being March of the Machine, and this week I wanted to give you 6 important takeaways, 6 things to keep in mind or to know before you draft this format or when you draft this format. I haven't drafted the format quite enough yet to come up with my list of, 10 cards I got wrong, which I think I'll have ready for next week. But I'm about 10 drafts in, and at this point, there are some big picture things that I think, I'm going to talk about that do a good job of sort of outlining how this format works. So I'm not ready to go like super deep on individual cards I think I got wrong, but I am ready to tell you broadly what this format is about. So the first thing is that the format is average speed. And I think that's the best place to be. It's not too fast, it's not too slow, and this adds for more viability of, basically all the decks. There are aggro decks in this format that can definitely run people over, but an important thing in this format is there's also lots of ways to get back ahead from behind, and that's usually crucial for like a control deck to work, because normally they're going to be behind on board early, and then they seize the advantage late. And cards like Tangled Skyline, for example, can really allow that, gaining you life, giving you a big body. So control decks are very real. I've had a few successful ones in the format. You can actually get back ahead from behind. The 6 mana 3/4 Fiend Hunter with Plane Cycling is really good at getting you back ahead from behind. And that's all really good. You can have these grindy value decks that actually work. And we didn't really see that in the last 2 sets. So it's a nice thing to see. So this isn't a format where you need to grab like all the 1 and 2 drops quite as aggressively as we've seen lately. You do need them, of course. And, generally in an ideal world, you're still going to play like a 2-drop that can trade. But because of things going on in this format, you also kind of need to have a top end if you're going to be a control deck. If you have a bunch of removal, that's kind of what you need to be doing. So it's not all in on aggro, and it's not really a slow format either. It's, right in the middle, which again, I think is the ideal speed because it means more diverse types of decks. You can play aggro, mid-range, or control in the format, and that hasn't been true in a while. The next really big, broad thing is that synergy is less important here, especially than we saw in like Phyrexia All Will Be One. That was a set where you basically had to be doing the synergy thing in your color pair, or you weren't going to do well. You had to be artifacts if you're in blue-white. If you were in black-white or green-white, you needed to be a poison deck. There were a few, the red-white color pair maybe was less synergistic than the others, but still had a big theme. But in this format, you can have a deck that has basically no mechanical synergy and win with it. And that is, again, an unusual thing. This feels a lot like an older core set in some ways, except not quite as boring. Old core sets also had incredibly simple cards that made things kind of uninteresting. But the fact is, like, the thing that's most important about your deck to keep in mind is whether you're aggro, mid-range, or control, as opposed to really making sure you have synergy pieces. And this is how things looked at the beginning of the format. When I did the archetype guide, especially, you see, if you go and watch that video, you'll see that there just aren't as many payoffs for most of the decks as usual. This isn't to say synergy isn't a thing. One of my 7-win decks was a blue-black mill deck that was very synergistic. That was my first 7-win deck in the format. I had a really good synergistic +1/+1 counter deck. But the point here is you don't have to be in a synergy deck to find success in this format. And I think that's mostly a good thing. It's not all good because I do think synergy and like being able to sort of build these cool board states where all your cards support each other and stuff, that can be a lot of fun. But right now, especially after what Phyrexia All Will Be One was, it's pretty nice that this set doesn't demand that you go all in on synergy to succeed. You just don't have to do it here. Another thing to keep in mind, because of that fact, the fact that synergy is less important, is that removal is really good. And cards that are just good, that are just flat rates, the good cards that are just powerful and don't really do anything super synergistic, are better than usual. And you should take them higher than a lot of the synergy pieces because, the less synergy there is throughout a set, the less important those few synergy pieces are in a lot of ways because there aren't that many things to actually help you get the payoff. So again, it's not that synergy is non-existent, but it isn't the end-all be-all in the format. It's sort of a polar opposite of what we saw, again, in Phyrexia All Will Be One. On a related note, this I do think is a Prince format. That means rares and mythics are really good. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. In some ways, that's part of what makes this format more viable for control decks because there are huge bombs in the format that can help those decks get back ahead from behind. And that's not something we see, especially because getting to 6 or 7 mana in a format like All Will Be One wasn't something you could count on that often, but in this one you can. This is also partly why removal's good though, because there are so many good rares in the format that you're going to run into a bunch of them. And if you can't answer many of them, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. Most of the rares in the set, for me, saying a Prince format doesn't mean that games are ruined by rares and mythics necessarily, but it does mean basically if you were in a pack one, pick one situation and you were to just pick the rare or mythic out of every pack, you would be right to do that like 80% of the time in this format. That's how skewed the format is towards these rares and mythics. But because everyone has them, it kind of evens out. And again, these powerful bombs are the kind of things that can pull a slower deck ahead from behind. And most of the bombs in the set, Itali and the sweeper that gives you an incubator notwithstanding, most of them are cards where if you answer them quickly, you aren't in a horrible shape. There's a few, like the ones I just mentioned, where you are, no matter what, when your opponent plays one of those cards, you're probably going to lose. But it's okay to have a few of those. So the high power level of bombs, of rares and mythics in this format, coupled with the fact that synergy isn't as big of a deal, means removal is a pretty high pick, which is, kind of how things usually are. But as you probably are aware, if you've been playing the last few formats, there are a lot of packs where you would take like a good synergistic card that is, especially in All Will Be One, where you had to have this critical mass of creatures with toxic and toxic payoffs, critical mass of artifacts, critical mass of oil counter things. There are times where you just passed like a solid to good removal spell to pick up a really good synergy piece, and you do that less here. Taking removal higher on average in this format than you would in most. You've got to be able to kill these rares, and synergy doesn't matter as much, so removal is back in a spot where you really want it, especially premium removal. Next, there is the fact that fixing is really good. This is something, in the set review, I thought it was going to be good, but not great. But in some ways, the fixing has proven to be great, at least at this stage of the format. I think once people realize there are all these gain lands and how good Skittering Surveyor is, maybe it's going to be harder. But right now, you can legitimately draft 4 or 5 color decks because of the cycle of common gain lands, because of Skittering Surveyor, and to a lesser extent because of the land cyclers. They're sort of the third tier of fixing, but they can do it for you. It was funny the other day on stream, and both of these videos will be up on YouTube this weekend. One of the decks is the one I mentioned earlier. It was like all in on synergy, a green-white deck. And then the other one was this like 5-color monstrosity where I just played all the really good rares I drafted because my fixing was so good. So this is something that connects to the Prince format thing. There are so many really good rares that picking up fixing early and often isn't a bad way to go. But, this crazy 5-color deck that basically didn't have any real synergy, if you really want to call like having good mana and playing good cards synergy, you can. But when we say synergy in Magic, especially in Limited, we're not usually talking about something that broad. You're talking about something more focused. And the deck didn't have that. But I had really good mana. I played a bunch of crazy bombs, and the deck did really well. And I thought it was kind of a fluke, but the more I've played the format, the more I've heard other people talk about the format. Seems like that's just a thing in this format. You can play multicolored decks really easily, and you can also, splashing a third color is a walk in the park, generally speaking, because of the fixing available in the format. So this, something else to keep in mind. So far the key things that I've mentioned are that the format isn't fast, it's about average. Synergy isn't as important as usual. The format is a Prince format, meaning rares are extra powerful. Removal and good stuff type things that are just good in any deck are even better in this format than usual, and fixing is really good. And then the last thing I want to mention, basically all the mechanics they introduced in this set are good to play in Limited, and that's something I'm pretty happy about, because there's a dud mechanic in just about every set. And in this one, I think the battles are good. I think backup is a good mechanic. I think incubator is good, and I think convoke is good. All of these like sort of central mechanics to the format are all pretty powerful. And these are mechanics that can push you a little bit towards synergy, but one of the thing about all of these is they're all good even when you don't have synergy. And that's kind of part of the, synergy isn't that important going on. I do want to go deeper on battles, especially given that they are, the new card type, the biggest mystery of the format going into it. But overall, I think they've actually panned out the way I expected, which is to say that the ones that cost 2 mana and the ones that impact the board, they're all good. Those are all good. There are a few exceptions for sure, but most of them are really good. They all perform really well. They're all very powerful. The reason for this is the cheap ones all give you something that maybe you're overpaying for a little bit, but then they have this huge upside. And if you never get that upside, it's not a big deal. And sometimes you don't. Sometimes you just don't attack battles, especially if you're a more aggressive deck. That is an important thing. Battles are much better on average in these sort of grindy type decks where you play it early, get some value out of it, and you probably don't transform it for a while, but you do later, and it's a turn that really turns the game around for you. So battle's also something that can pull you back ahead from behind in the right situation. So the cheap ones are, really nice because they give you a ton of value for the investment. And then the ones that impact the board can often set things up so that you can attack them right away and get the card out of them right away, which feels like a 2-for-1, even if you're giving away a little bit of damage by attacking the battle. There are some that just aren't good, and they're mostly the ones that cost more than 2 that also don't impact the board. So it's actually not that many. Most of the bad ones are like rares or mythics, funnily enough, which makes sense. Like Invasion of Arcavios is just terrible. But most of them are pretty nice. It's going into the format, I was reasonably confident they would be good. Mostly because they have experience doing this in the past. What I mean is, in War of the Spark, they threw 36 Planeswalkers at us, which is about the same number of battles we have in this set. And pretty much all of them were good, and they were a big part of the format. And then more recently in Neon Dynasty, they made sagas a huge feature in the format, and pretty much all of them were good, and they were a big part of the format. And so part of the reason I was confident battles would work out is because they have a track record of introducing these sort of format-defining things and having them work out okay, or better. They're not all good, and again, you do value them a little less if you are an aggro deck, but for the most part, the battles have turned out to be good. Backup tends to be the mechanic that enables aggro decks the most frequently, but it's good, everywhere. Again, it's good in any kind of deck. Incubator, giving you these, token bodies that you can cash in later, has been good in really all the decks. It's definitely better in a grindier deck than in like an aggro deck, just because, spending all of that mana to make a creature isn't ideal. And then Convoke has been really good, upgrades a lot of spells. I do still hate that there are situations in this format where your opponent's tapped out and they can still interact. That I think is not a great design, personally, at least not to have it happen as much as it can. But these mechanics have all turned out to be pretty good. If you go into a draft and you drafted like every card with Battle, Backup, Incubator, and Convoke, pretty good chance you're going to do okay, just because those cards, all of those cards that feature those mechanics have been solid or better. So those are the 6 sort of big picture things to keep in mind as you are playing this format. Hopefully this will help you. If you haven't been doing well in the format so far, hopefully this will help you do so. Let's go ahead and open up a Crack-A-Pack now, as we usually do. This is where I'll show you a pack one, pick one scenario and talk about what card I would pick out of the pack. And also talk about all the other cards in the pack too. All right, so here's our pack. Our first common is Tarkir Duneshaper. Oh, I guess this is a mechanic I could have mentioned too. It sort of slips my mind because it feels the least, I guess, special of the mechanics. But it is a good one. The ability, basically all the cards that can transform into Phyrexians on the other side, most of them are pretty good too. They almost all have, around maybe you're overpaying for the front side a little bit. And in terms of mana, you overpay for the back side too, but the card overall ends up being good because of its flexibility. Tarkir Duneshaper is not like the best example. It's a card that doesn't even always make the cut necessarily, but it's a 1-mana 1/2 that can turn into a 4/3 trampler late, and that's a nice option to have if you're flooding out late or whatever. Gives you some flood insurance in a lot of ways. And a lot of them can transform the turn after you play them, which can be particularly devastating, though I don't recommend trying to do that when your opponent has mana up and cards in hand. And they often will. If you're playing like a 2-drop one and then trying to transform it on turn 3, probably not a great idea, but if your opponent plays their own 2-drop, you're going to be in pretty good shape to transform it a lot of the time. So yeah, Duneshaper, not something I want to first pick, but it is pretty nice. Our battle slot in this pack is Invasion of New Capenna. This is both cheap and impacts the board, so obviously that's something I like. Unlike the other cheap ones, you can't actually play it early most of the time. I mean, you can, I guess. You don't have to use its effect. Obviously, you want to, because you have to have something in play to sacrifice so that you can exile an opposing creature. But that's a good effect. Like, that's a card that would be okay in a lot of limited formats, even though you can't play this one early. But it does still, like, let's say, get a blocker out of the way, allow you to attack it immediately, and then you get a pretty good piece of equipment on the back, which, at worst is going to put a counter on your creature every time it attacks. And if you're in black-white, there's a good chance most of your creatures are Phyrexian. So it's powerful. I don't hate the idea of first picking it. First picking gold cards is a little less painful in this format than usual because fixing is good, so I wouldn't hate taking it. Our Multiverse Legends card is Furia, Judge of Valor. She's pretty good, she has okay base stats and will occasionally draw you a card. She loads your graveyard too, which you care a little bit about in black-white in this format. I don't think she's amazing, though. I think I would take Invasion of New Capenna over her, if this is where things end. Next up, we've got Core Halberd at common. This is an okay piece of equipment. All the common equipment are all okay. None of them are great, and this is one of them. It does enhance creatures reasonably well. It offers a decent stats boost for the cost, etc. But it's just not that powerful. It's not always worth the card in all decks. So, it's definitely not something you take early. Scroll Shift is next. This is another kind of card. We see it all the time, and it just usually doesn't work out. It's easy to overrate these. People always look at this, and you can make a pretty long list of things this can do. It helps my creature dodge removal. It allows me to rebind into the battlefield ability. It gets an aura off of my creature. I can block something and use it so that my creature doesn't die. Like, there's a long list of things you can do. Gives your creature pseudo-vigilance. The problem is, most of those, except for, the enter the battlefield part and the save from removal part, they're too narrow and not that powerful, even though this replaces itself. Even with backup in this set, I haven't really found myself wanting to shove Scroll Shift into my decks. Like, the decks that are the most into backup, like red-white, it's like an aggro deck. And most of the time, you'd rather just play a 3-drop than play something like Scroll Shift. Arachnoid Adaptation. This is an okay trick. Tricks do feel, over the last, I guess, maybe dating back to New Capenna, in virtually every set, tricks have been really good, like better than they were before. In this set, I don't quite think that's true. There's some exceptions. The white trick that gives protection is powerful, but I don't think Arachnoid Adaptation is super good, or even a card that always makes the cut, even in an aggro deck, whereas it probably would have been in some of the more recent formats. Part of this is there's a lot of cheap interaction in the set that can blow you out. Part of it is you're less all in on aggro in this format than we've seen over the last several sets, so using a trick like this to attack through something matters a lot less. I think we're still on Invasion of New Capenna. We've got Halo Charged Scob next. This card's not great, and you might be saying, I'm surprised to hear you say that because you played it in the early access event and you had it in a 7-win deck, and that's true. I had an incredibly synergistic blue-black mill deck that had 2 copies of C Double, so I was able to loop this. And if you have 2 C Doubles, then yeah, you're going to play Halo Charge Scob. If you have a bunch of graveyard stuff going on, you're going to play the Scob, but it doesn't make it all the time, even in a blue-black deck. You have better, more meaningful things that can mill both players than the Scob, but it's okay. I'm not saying it's unplayable, just that I wouldn't take it over, I would take Furia, Invasion of New Capenna, Dune Shaper ahead of it. I would take it over these other 3 commons, and I would take it over this next common, which I think is the worst of the bunch. That is Aki Scrap Chomper. So I do think the Sacrifice deck is a thing in the format, but, in the set review, I didn't think this would be very good, and it has panned out that way. The problem with it is that it's such a meaningless card early in basically every way, because a 1-mana 1/1 is quickly outclassed, and then you can't really use the other ability until the extreme late game, basically, is when it starts to matter. And so it's a meaningless card for a huge chunk of the game, and you can't really afford to have that. Next up, it is Cut Short. This is a solid, not premium removal spell. It is one of these Convoke cards that you can cast with your opponent having no idea it's coming, although they have to know because you have to think about it in this format, but sometimes it's easy to forget. It is pretty good removal. I don't think it's premium because it's narrow enough. I think I would take the Invasion and Furia both over it, even though they're both gold cards. Our next common is Etched Host Doombringer. This has been solid. I've seen it win a few battles. I haven't managed to pull that off myself. And then the life drain effect, this isn't the ideal way for a slower deck to stabilize because it's not quite meaningful enough. But it can kind of help you buy another turn, like a 5-mana 3/5 that drains 2, can probably block one of their creatures, and it gains you a bit of life. So it is a card that can sort of give you an extension on getting back ahead from behind. It doesn't usually do it all on its own, but it does work okay in that sort of controlling deck. Still on Invasion of New Capenna, we have another pretty mediocre common here in Atraxa's Fall, our last common. If you're playing in best of 3, it's an okay sideboard card. It doesn't have enough targets to play in your main deck in the format, though, so, we don't want it. So yeah, we're on Invasion of New Capenna. Our first uncommon is going to change that, though. It's Tandem Takedown. So this is a really great removal spell. The one thing about it that's sort of a bummer is the double green. If you do end up in a deck that's playing 4 or 5 colors in a format, usually the best thing to do is play early removal that doesn't have more than one colored, 1 pip of a single color. And so, playing this in that kind of deck isn't easy, but you're also not really guaranteed to have a creature, so it's not a big loss. This is definitely better in a more creature-based, aggressive deck, but, it's great. It's premium removal. Sometimes you can even turn the +1/+0 trigger part of it into a combat trick or into doing more damage. So it has a ton of upside, and I would take it over everything else in the pack. Tangled Skyline is next. This is sort of my preferred card for pulling back ahead from behind in the format. Gaining 5 is a big deal against the more aggressive decks that you need to be prepared for. And then, the 5/5 you get out of it with reach, which this usually also gives some of your creatures already in play reach, can really help you stabilize. So it's nice. I would take Takedown over it because you don't really play the Skyline in every deck, and you play the Takedown in at least in all of your 2-colored green decks. So I like it here. Our rare is pretty good. It's Fairy Mastermind. So, I said, this is a Prince format. If you just took the rare or mythic, out of a pack, of course, some of them have more than one, so you need to know which one to take. You'll be okay, but more often than you won't be if you just took the highest rarity card. And that's probably true here. It's not miles better than everything else we have going on in the pack, but it is pretty good. 2-mana 2/1 flash, flying, and punishing your opponent for drawing extra cards, and having the ability to make your opponent and yourself draw extra cards is pretty powerful. I think it's really close between Tandem Takedown and Fairy Mastermind, but I probably take the Mastermind in the end. It just slots into every kind of deck in the format. Whether you're aggro or control, it works really, really well, and it's a powerful card. Not a bomb, but it is a good rare. So that's, I think, what I would take in the end here. All right, so that does it for this edition of Nizzanotes. Next week's video will be the top, where I talk about, probably be 20, 25 drafts in the format by then, and talk about the 10 cards I got wrong that I already know I got wrong by that stage. I'm sure, there's always 10 by that point. It's hard to be perfect. So I'm sure I'll have enough to talk about next week. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it. If you want to catch that video next week, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to see draft videos of this format or my set review, you should see playlists for those things on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.